had finished the road to the war. We would now begin the road towards a final solution. Is that it? Okay. Now, as I said last time and also before, that the road to the final solution is parallel to the road to the war. Each time when on one level a progress, that is an advancement was made, Hitler would look to it that the other level would follow or would move up to the same standards to some degree. So, and that is the reason why we can use our subdivision in three. That is, remember when you look on your notes with the road to the war, we said the first period is from 1933 to 1934. That corresponds to the secret rearmament and also to the consolidation of his absolute power in Germany. Then we got to the second level from 1935 to 1937. This corresponded to the violation of all kinds of, let's say, commitments in regards to the Versailles Peace Treaty, except the open territorial violations against Germany's neighbors. And then ultimately from 1938 till 1939, when we got to the preliminaries, before the conquest of living space would begin, then we get also to the preliminaries before the final solution would begin. So in this regard, we keep the same subdivision, 33, 34, 35, 37, 38, 39. Let's begin with 1933, 1934. First of all, you must keep in mind that Germany had, for about 66 million people, a Jewish population of about 500,000. And that right at the beginning, when Hitler came to power, a number of these Jewish German citizens who had eminent positions in culture, in sciences, in the fine arts, in education, they left because knowing, after all, Hitler's ideas and his feelings about Jewish people were not a secret. He repeated this in his many speeches, and this was well known. So some of them preferred to leave at once. And the most famous one of these individuals was, without any doubt, Albert Einstein. He left Germany and never to return there. There were others who left. They were not always Jewish, but who left also because of their hostility against National Socialism, and who ultimately at least came back. And that was, I think I mentioned her name already once to you, that was a famous actress in the German movie The Blue Angel, who made then a career also in the United States, Marlene Dietrich. But let's leave her aside. So during the first 2 years, Hitler could, as this corresponds to the secret rearmament and to this consolidation of powers, he could not fully show his hand as far as anti-Semitism was concerned, or at least he could not go as far as he might have been tempted or might have wanted to. So what were then Hitler's acts? What was he doing then during these 2 years? First of all, he used, in order to intimidate, it was matters of intimidation, not only of the Jewish people, but also of the German public, that they should watch out, that they should keep off from Jewish people. In other words, during the year 33, not only until 34, but even until 39, this was an attempt to build up around the Jewish people either an invisible and later on a real ghetto, to isolate them. Once they would be isolated, the Nazis could more easily deal with them and prepare them for the final solution. So in other words, it was a systematic policy of isolating the Jewish people. And the first thing was, of course, that after all, the Jewish people, most of them, did mix up with the German population. Of course, they still had the habit to also be, at least some of the most religious Jewish people and some others too, to remain amongst themselves, in social terms, or in professional terms, or in terms of family relations. But altogether, nonetheless, that was certainly not the majority. They were spread in the whole German people, among the whole German population. Now, the Nazis launched a number of movements, so that, first of all, that they would bring a wedge between Jewish people and German people, and at the same time isolate the Jewish people more and warn the German people not to keep this kind of close relations with the Jewish people. Now, how did he do this? He used essentially, as long as they were around, and they were around until June 1934, the SA. The SA, these brutal hooligans which Röhm was organizing, and they counted originally maybe 100,000 or 200,000. Once Hitler was in power, the number of SA did rise rapidly and steeply, so much even that when Hitler settled accounts with the SA in June 1934, they numbered nearly 4 million. He used the SA, as this was a mass organization, and as Germany was still in the throes of unemployment, he used them to exert violence against Jewish people, against Jewish stores, and against those Germans who dared to come close to Jewish people. So how did he do it? He would organize boycotts of Jewish stores, of Jewish cultural sites. And in order to carry out these boycotts, he would use the SA, who would be posted then before Jewish stores and would not let others in, or would shout at them, would even use violence against those who dared to come in. He used them also for making violence to the Jewish people as such, getting away without police intervention, for instance. So this was done systematically. He did one thing that was on April 1st, 1933. In reality, it was not one day, but there were 3 days where they organized an open boycott of Jewish stores, of Jewish interest. And they went so far, their wickedness and their insidiousness was without boundaries. They would, for instance, the same way as they did throw hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people into concentration camps, allegedly, they called it Schutzhaft, protective custody, in order to protect them there against the anger, the ire, the fury of the common people outside. Here they would say, we organize this official public boycott in order to let the anti-Jewish feelings of the vast majority of the German people out during these 2-3 days, so that they will calm down afterwards. It was just perversion. It was just perversion. It was a systematic, so-called spontaneous organization of anti-Semitic demonstrations and boycotts. But that was not all. Besides this, they would also begin, and they could do it because the Nazis at the beginning, they controlled the Ministry of the Interior, which did not only control the police, which also controlled the public service. Frick was one of the Nazi ministers of the Interior. Göring was Minister of the Interior in Prussia. So it was through Frick, who was, by the way, a doctor, he had a PhD in law, that he started now purging, we cannot use any other word, or dismissing Jewish people from the public service. The first area where they started were Jewish judges. They would be dismissed from the courts, from the tribunals. Then they extended this to other state functionaries. But here they met, curiously, Hitler met curiously an unexpected resistance. And this resistance came from the President of the Republic. When it must have been April 3rd, when Hindenburg heard that Frick had dismissed a number of Jewish state functionaries from their positions, he wrote a letter to Hitler where he asked him to revise this, at least for those Jewish people who had served in the German army in World War I, who had been wounded, who had deserved well during their service in the German army. And Hitler had to pull back. He would answer, of course, because he was aware that Hindenburg, after all, he could dismiss him, and that he had to take regards as far as Hindenburg was concerned. So Hitler did reinstate a number of those who had been dismissed, but this did not change basically his attitude. And by the way, he will wait until Hindenburg died. When Hindenburg died on August 2nd, 1934, he would give again full application to his anti-Semitic violence by dismissing all those who were in state positions. That was not all. They also passed out a law, a directive, in which the number of Jewish people who could register for the universities would be limited to their proportionate number in regard to the whole German population. I'll have to say a word about this. Remember what we mentioned when we spoke about anti-Semitism and this racialism. I told you that it was not a surprise that Jewish people occupied top positions in many places of the German public life, not just in the state administration, also in sciences, in fine arts, wherever. And of course the Nazis and Hitler considered this as a deliberate move to dominate, to gain full control over Germany. Whereas the real explanation was much more pragmatic. And I had given you the example of the French Huguenots. When a minority lives in a context where a vast majority dominates, in order to prevail, in order not to be crushed, this minority has to work harder, to educate its children tougher, to strive much more in order to survive. And by doing this, naturally, a greater number of individuals out of the minority get into top position because they simply worked harder, they tried harder, and they ultimately made it. And that is also how a greater number of Jewish students studied at the universities than they represented proportionately to the Jewish population inside the German population. Now they reduced it. I did not check, I did not find evidence how many were dismissed, but one could imagine that at least half, if not more, could not register, because they were many more than the non-Jewish students at the university. But Frick, of course, was carrying out only what Hitler said and what the SS wanted and so on. That was so. Here they also went into the field of studies, into the field of fine arts and culture. And remember Goebbels. Goebbels had been relatively early appointed Minister for Culture and Propaganda. And that was just after the elections of March 5th. It must have been March 10th or the 11th. Then Goebbels was put into this position. Now, as such, nobody could play a role in the cultural life of Germany if he did not have the go-ahead of Goebbels. In other words, if Goebbels would not give him the permission to practice this activity. And of course, this way they could slowly move out artists, scientists, teachers, composers, wherever. And so this is why quite a few of them, not all, but quite a few of them left Germany in order to go to France, to England, or to the United States. So this way, the anti-Semitic measures did find a practical application. Now, it was not a surprise that Jewish people outside of Germany, and particularly Jewish associations in the United States, they protested against this. And they would even think of organizing the boycott of German goods in their countries as a response to these anti-Jewish policies which were carried out in Germany. Now, Hitler, of course, in his vicious attitude, he would then take those protests as being the origins for the anti-Semitic policy in Germany. He would say, he would turn, and particularly Goering who carried this out, he would turn to the German Jews and say, you are the ones who stimulate your Jewish brothers in the state to act against us, so you have to pay for it. So in other words, it was just reversing the reality. The origins was the anti-Semitic policy in Germany, and then came the protests in the United States. Hitler would say, our reaction is against the anti-Nazi demonstrations in the United States. There was just one area in which the Germans, at least to begin with, were careful. Not because they had any kind of tender feelings in this area for the Jews, but for practical reasons. And that was in the field of finances and the economy. There were, first of all, a number of top Jewish banks in Germany. Not just the Rothschild Bank, but there were quite a few others too. And they played a role in the German financial and economic life. And that is why, once Hitler came to power, and once he would launch on a program to get out of the crisis, even though it might be through building up war industries, but he needed, nonetheless, the cooperation of these Jewish people. They also, some of them, had occupied, because of their know-how in financial and economic matters, top positions in the German economy ministries. And Hitler could fall back on one nationalist and one conservative who had the reputation of being like a financial wizard. It is the same man who had helped, and we had seen that, even though I might not have mentioned his name, who had helped Stresemann in 1923, when the German currency was totally down, to launch a new German currency and get out of this financial mess. Do you know the name? Some of you might have met him in Bullock or elsewhere. It begins with an SCH. Yes, Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht. He has a very strange first name. I never found out where this name came from. Hjalmar. Now you do not have to write it down, just out of curiosity. Hjalmar. Hjalmar. Schacht. Schacht was the architect of the German economic recovery, and he made also Hitler's war industries possible. But he nonetheless, from the moment on, not because Hitler was leading straight to the war, but in 1937, he resigned. He resigned because he was in disagreement with Goering, who was put in charge of the 4 years plan. Now, Schacht resigned not because of any kind of moral inhibitions and moral scruples that Germany was going straight to the war, but essentially because Hitler was overdoing in terms of unorthodox financial decisions. So he resigned. And I open a parenthesis here, and then we turn back to our issue. He was tried after World War II, the same as Papen. He was tried because the Allies accused him for having been the man who made Hitler's war preparations possible, because he helped him get Germany economically going again. But the same as Papen, he was ultimately acquitted, to my surprise. Oh, not only my surprise, many people were surprised that he got away with it, the same as Papen. But here, Schacht, from the beginning on, Schacht, as long as he could, because he appreciated the expertise of these Jewish bankers and the Jewish, let's say, top functionaries to help him get the German economy moving again. That was one thing why he protected Jewish people in the area of finances and the economy. There was another reason, and this had to do with foreign policy, because there were not only Jewish people in Germany who played a role in the German economic recovery, but also Jewish banks outside, Jewish bankers outside, and those who were, let's say, closely associated with him. If there would be a kind of anti-German alliance on the level of high finances as a kind of protest against the German attitude towards the Jewish population, this would hurt the German war effort, the German recovery. So in other words, here they had a certain caution. They would let the Jewish people in their position. But everywhere else, it was very clear that they were removed from their original positions. Those Jewish people who were rich enough and who had family abroad and who could afford, they started leaving Germany, particularly banking families, but not all did, and also scientists and other artists, writers, composers, and so on. It was also from that moment on that they started issuing laws forbidding marriages, even before the Nuremberg racialist laws, about which we will be talking about. They made it clear that they did not approve marriages between Germans and Jewish people, and they would even try to put pressure on the partner who was not Jewish to divorce. And they would then, before they passed the law at the time of the Nuremberg legislation, they would even, through the boycott of the SA, they would even interfere in the red light district area, preventing the kind of, let's say, sexual relations between Jewish and German people. You know that when you are on the wrong track, then there is nothing which stops you from the most devious acts of behavior. Even in this regard, they went even far beyond. They sometimes even, and there are, you can see movies, historical movies, where they singled out a prostitute and put a sign on her. They would even put her before the camera, or make a picture, put a sign on her, a white shield, and say, that's how I am having sex with Jews. This kind of attitudes was what the Nazis did not even shrink away from, going down to this kind of meanest level.
You said that the Nazis would put pressure on, like, if someone was married to a Jew, to divorce them. Like, did a lot of people end up divorcing?
The majority did not. The majority refused. There were exceptions, but usually when there was a normally good working couple, the other one refused to separate from his wife or from her husband. So they did not get, even though they put pressure, and they also tried to intimidate them, but then retaliating against their children and so on. They used every device to create difficulties and to isolate let's say, the Jewish population. I would like to say one thing very clearly. Very often, and you find that also in a reference in Davidovich, very often the historians would argue, saying, well, look, why did they not leave in 1933 or in 1935 or in 1938 even? Some left. The number of Jewish people in Germany was shrinking. From 500,000 at the eve of the war, they might have gone down to 300,000. 200,000 might have left. But the reason why, and I will not have to address this more thoroughly, there were two reasons why this did not happen. First of all, there were several. First of all, the Jewish people felt a double allegiance. They felt themselves as Jewish people and they felt themselves as Germans. And they considered that they had nothing to blame themselves for of being good Germans, because after all they had served in World War I. So in other words, they did not have any kind of a guilt feeling which the Nazis tried to suggest that they were bad Germans. They were not. And that's why they considered that Germany was their homeland, and that's where they wanted to stay. That is one thing. The second thing is that we very often, even those who have no sympathy for National Socialism whatsoever, but there is a widespread idea that all Jewish people are rich, that they all are bankers, that they have lots of money. And that is totally besides the point. There were and there are rich Jewish people, very rich, but the majority of the Jewish population reflected nonetheless more or less the same kind of spectrum which was also true for the rest of the German population. There might be more rich people, but there were middle-sized and poor people the same as in the other social areas of the German population. So in other words, they could not afford. Where would they go? Because they did not have family relations elsewhere. So in this regard, they stayed. And they still hoped what had happened in the past, in the days of pogroms, that the storm would, quiet down. That after a time period of intensive persecution, that somehow this would end somehow. And then there is one last consideration, which I would like also to mention. And that is simply that they could not go wherever they might have wanted to go. They needed visas. And from 1933 on, in Europe and all over the world, most countries were absolutely opposed to let Jewish immigrants in, not because of any kind of anti-Semitic prevailing trend, but simply because of the unemployment situation in many countries. Their public opinion considered that these Jewish immigrants would take their jobs. So in other words, they did not issue then visas. Only some South American countries would, and then, of course, they would only do it if Jewish international agencies paid for it, for getting those visas. So in other words, there were many reasons why there was not now a massive exodus of Jewish people. They could not afford it, they did not want to, and they didn't have any place to go. So that is why the situation deteriorated. A minority left, those who could afford and those who found opportunities, but the majority stayed behind and ultimately, lost their lives. Because nobody imagined that there could be somebody having this kind of an absolutely radical, crazy idea as to exterminate the whole population. Because in the past, these outbreaks of anti-Semitism, they were passionate, I do not excuse them, but they were not deliberately staged and systematically carried out as they will be carried out later on. And then there is one last consideration. That is, once the war was on, once the situation after September 1939, once we will come closer to the final solution, then it was impossible to leave. They were caught. At that time, it was too late. They could not get out any longer. Yes?
Could you just briefly repeat each of those reasons that Jews didn't leave Germany?
Well, the first thing was that they felt as much as Germans as much as Jews. They had this double allegiance, and they considered that there was no reason why they would they would have to leave because they had no guilt towards it. They had always stood to their country. And then there's this other reason: only people who had certain international relations and who were rich could afford to leave, whereas the majority of the Jewish population did not have the financial means to do this. And then there was also the widespread conviction that these anti-Semitic measures would subside, and that after the storm there would be again better time period, and that it was a matter of patience. And then ultimately also that they could not go wherever they wanted to because they needed visas. And most other countries were very, let's say, restrictive in issuing visas because there was the economic crisis, and the Jewish immigrants would be considered as those who would take the jobs of the nationals wherever they came. And by the way, that was not only true for the United States, that was also true for Germany's neighbors. That was true for Belgium, for Holland, for Luxembourg, for France, for all those countries. And that was certainly, of course you could say, well, nobody imagined that if they would not let them in, that this would mean their death. That is true too. But it was, and there existed also, don't forget that, there existed a vague, widespread anti-Semitic background among some elements of the population. We have seen that when we spoke about the roots of anti-Semitism in Europe in general.
How did Albert Einstein get to leave then?
I do not know whether he went first to Switzerland. He might have. Then I am not too much familiar with his biography, but he left relatively early, and he was so shocked that he would never. He also stated that he would never go back to Germany because of this. Now, so in other words, during these 2 years, 1933, 34, it was very clear that the Nazis were going to, they did already implement an anti-Semitic policy, but they did do this to some degree in the streets by harassing Jewish people in a very arbitrary way through these SA hooligans, and by trying to remove them from important positions. They watched out to keep them into the important positions in the area of finances and the economy. But things changed from 1935 on. From 1935 on, Hitler was turning the screw and was now implementing more systematically his anti-Semitic policy. There was no power inside Germany to stop him. And no power, no institution, and also most of those, let's say, most of the German establishment did not care for this. Some regretted it, but they certainly did not object to it. So he had a free hand. And this was initiated for good from 1935 on. There, of course, the other measures were still continued, but from September 15th, 1935, the Nazi Germany issued the so-called Nuremberg racialist legislation. Now, this Nuremberg racialist legislation was an outcome of the Nuremberg party rally of September 13th, 1935. Now, remember what I said just before, that the Nazis moved parallel. As close, once they got closer to the war, then they would also move closer to the isolation of the Jewish people. Now, by September 1935, which treaties had they violated by that time, which allowed them to move ahead in terms of war preparations? I can't help testing once in a while. Yes? The Versailles Treaty, that's much too large. Which precise clauses of the Versailles Treaty had they violated?
conquest of living space.
Had they moved into
The
the Rhineland?
The Rhineland will be March 1936. Yes. The three rearmament prohibition treaties. The first, the Luftwaffe, remember Goering, March 9th, 1935. Then Hitler, the introduction of the compulsory military service. And then the British even condoning in signing a naval agreement which also represented a violation of the naval limitations the Versailles Treaty had imposed upon the Nazis. So in other words, there were three major violations which had preceded. Now Hitler felt that he had also to move ahead now in terms of moving closer to the final solution. And he used now the Nuremberg rally to launch two types of legislation. One was a legislation which divided up, which separated the Jewish population from the ordinary German population. So Hitler made, that it was not Hitler, the one who carried this out was Frick again, because that is also the reason why Frick, when he was later tried, and in the Nuremberg war criminals trials, he did not escape death condemnation and execution. So Frick determined that there would be two categories of inhabitants. One would be a Reich subject. That would be a person who lived inside the Reich, inside Germany. The second would be a Reich citizen. The Reich citizen was somebody who was a full Aryan blood individual, who could prove that he was absolutely full Aryan blood. A Reich subject was an alien, and of course it was a kind of cover word for the Jewish population. They will have, their rights will be diminished from that moment on. In a sense, this is irony and hypocrisy, because you know that Hitler had established an absolute dictatorship. So even the full Reich citizens, what kind of liberties did they have? But at least they had a certain protection as far as their rents were concerned. Well, there were a number of social and other protections they had. But from now on, there will be something close to more than 400 different laws will practically exclude the Jewish people from having those advantages. In other words, these laws all had as a goal to isolate them, to separate them from the bulk of the German population. They would not be, they would first of all, they would be expelled from the key positions in the German administration. The last areas from which they will be expelled will be the economy. Then they will be prevented from using common transportation. They could not take the tram, they could not take the train. Then they would be prevented from going to theaters, to movies, to parks. Then they would ultimately be, their children would be kicked out of German schools. They would even be prevented from their kids from having pets. Can you imagine? No Jewish children or no Jewish households were allowed to have pets. In other words, it was and amongst those there was one, which I mentioned when we spoke about Hitler's past. There was one of those laws stipulated that no German woman under 45 could be a servant in a Jewish household. And this, of course, could be easily brought in relationship to the fact that Hitler's grandmother, when she gave birth to Hitler's father, at that time she was 43 and she served in a Jewish household. The second type of regulations they brought out was to define of who was a Jew and who was not a Jew. And this had to do with now the open interdiction for marriages between Jews and non-Jews, and also from sexual relations, from extramarital sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. And the fines which were established here on, they were very heavy. Later on, they would even go as far as even not hesitate to use the death penalty if somebody transgressed these laws. This had to do essentially with Hitler's, let's say, inhibited frustrations going back to Vienna days, when Hitler was watching how these Jewish youth were, getting around with good-looking so-called Aryan girls and having a good time with them. That was Freudian, really, and it had also to do with what he read in Lanz von Liebenfeld's kind of, I should say, devious description of pollution of Aryan blood by Jewish people. It was extravagant, this whole thing. It was, but it had its origins in this Hitler's experience from Vienna days. Now, they defined now who was now a Jew and who was not a Jew. First of all, those who had 4 Jewish grandparents. If you had 4 Jewish grandparents, you were considered to be a Jew. If you had 3 Jewish grandparents, you also were considered to be a Jew. If you had 2 Jewish grandparents, that opened up, then you were a mishling, that is, a mixed blood. And then all depended on what your religious practice and what your relationship with the Jewish community were. So here they could make an exception, but later on they would nonetheless consider this mishling. You find more out of it in Davidovich when you go through the appropriate chapters, which I already indicated to you. If you had 1 Jewish grandparent and 3 non-Jewish grandparents, then you were considered not being Jewish. But nonetheless, it was a stain on your pedigree, even though you were not considered as Jewish. And that was precisely the problem of whom? Heydrich, yes. He had Jewish blood. And that was a stain, even though if 3/4 of the blood he had from grandparents was non-Jewish. So this kind of legislation was now the means which they continued to implement from 35 to 36 to 37, and they will, from 37 on, they will introduce, I forgot to mention that they also, and that was on a free basis, many restaurants, many cafes would pass a sign, Jews are undesirable. They would not be accepted there. But then, in order to single out Jewish people from Aryan people, in terms an open job could be applied for. Jewish applicants, whether they were men or women, they had to add to their first name a Jewish name. Men had to add to their normal first name Israel, and women had to add to their normal first name Sarah. So if then applications would come, and they would immediately be identified as being Jewish people simply by this addition to this background, to this added first name. Now, as a consequence of this, the Jewish community, particularly also the Jewish schools, Jewish artists, they were practically surrounded by an invisible ghetto. They could not participate any longer in the normal public life of ordinary Germans. They had to stay with themselves. They had to educate their own children. They had to write. They were not allowed to have a German flag. They later on would not even be allowed to write in German. They had to use then their Yiddish. In other words, more and more Hitler would isolate them. And even though in this isolation, once a while, they left when they could. The year 1936 was the only year where there was for some months a certain, let's say, pause in the fierce application of this legislation. And this pause did occur at the time of the Olympic Games in Berlin. But once the Olympic Games in Berlin were over, they still resolved to the application of the same legislation in every field, and they even added more to it. And so that by 1937, the Jewish population in Germany was already, in many ways, if not in real ghettos, because after all, they could not afford to do that because this would have produced an outcry in Germany and worldwide, but they were isolated. And the ghettoization means isolation. Material, they were not materially, but they were, in terms of legislation, in terms of, in social terms, in intellectual terms, in cultural terms, they were already living in a ghetto. And so with the year 1938 now, we move closer again to the war, because the year 1938 created a new situation. First of all, the annexation of Austria. And with the annexation of Austria, another 180,000 Jewish people were added to the 300 and maybe even 350 or 60,000 which remained in Germany. So in other words, the Jewish population increased, but anti-Semitism was already widespread in Austria. Hitler, after all, did not practically assimilate this kind of rabid anti-Semitic visions because of a non-anti-Semitic background in Vienna. In Vienna, there was a strong anti-Semitic background, the same as there was a strong anti-Semitic background in Poland, as we will see when we get there. But of course, in Poland, it was of a religious nature, whereas in Vienna, there had been racialist elements which played a role in this. Now, with the annexation of Austria, as I said, Hitler was making gambles now. And the second gamble was then Munich, that is the failed destruction of Czechoslovakia, but the annexation of these Sudeten German territories with the Sudeten German populations. Certainly by that time, remember, Hitler had, the year before, on November 5th, 1937, he had laid down his cards before his advisors, stating very clearly that war might come as soon as 1938, but should not come later than 1943. So in other words, we move now into a situation where the likelihood that war might break out became much greater. And so the Nazis were tightening the screw again. And they tightened the screw in two ways before the Reichskristallnacht. It was the SS, it was Himmler essentially. Himmler and Heydrich, which were now promoting these anti-Semitic measures. And so, but of course, each time on behalf of Hitler. They would, for instance, declare that all those Jews who had emigrated from Russia in the days of the Bolshevik Revolution, that they were denied German citizenship. Of course, they could not bring them back to Russia. That was a little bit more complicated to the Soviet Union. But when they did the same, when they denied German citizenship also to those of Poland, then they would begin to bring them back to their Polish homeland. Some of those who had come to Germany did come in 1918, but some had already come in 1914. And it was precisely on this issue that Herschel Greenspan, this Polish Jewish youth who had grown up in Germany and who had left Germany to Paris, that he made this assassination attempt against the ambassador, and this assassination attempt ended up with the death of the third Councillor von Rath. I do not repeat what we saw last time. That is the outbreak of the greatest pogrom. That was certainly, let's say, a clear sign of what Hitler had really in store for the Jewish population. And so from now on, the anti-Semitic, not only the anti-Semitic legislation was now carried much further, but also the Nazis were now already thinking on how this final solution might be implemented later on. And the SS will be put in charge of this. So in other words, parallel to the implementation of this anti-Semitic isolation policy and also preparation for the final solution, did they carry out their eugenics policy. Their eugenics policy had to do with racialist health. In other words, they were now turning towards their own population and examining which German children and German adults were mentally and physically fit, did not have mental or physical handicaps. And so even at a previous stage, they had, in order to stick to their line of purification of the German people, that was not only a purification leading to the genocide of the Jewish people, that was also a purification first in terms of preventing the physically and mentally handicapped to procreate children. So in other words, sterilization. They first operated on the level of sterilization. They passed laws through which whoever was mentally or physically handicapped had to undergo, not voluntarily, a treatment of sterilization. But even this, let's say, if we can use the word, moderate eugenics program, in the eyes of many Nazis, this did not go far enough. Because then they added, besides the fact that they should not have offspring, that they should not continue to expose the pure Aryan race to having with them handicapped mentally or physically, they also considered, in the event of a war, that all the human and particularly also the food resources should be managed in such a way that it should be rationalized. And they considered, in that case, that mentally or physically handicapped people were mouths which should not be fed. They were taking away the food to those who were prepared to fight for Germany. So in other words, the issue came up that sterilization would not be enough, that euthanasia, and not a free euthanasia, but a forced euthanasia, had to be imposed. And of course, this was in late 38, early 39. Things were getting closer, and they had, of course, to cover this kind of a policy. They could not openly proclaim this. And so they used all kinds of means to hide what they planned to do and what they were doing.
These people taken to concentration camps too?
No, not yet. No. they were not taken to concentration camps. They will be taken to death installations when they came to the euthanasia program. So Hitler took the advice of a number of doctors, of his immediate environment, you find the names, it was Buhler, it was Bracke, it was Brandt, and there were a number of top Nazi doctors who advised Hitler on how to do it. And so they devised then the means to bring physically and mentally handicapped children to certain children's nurseries, well, officially called nurseries. But in reality, they were brought to specific places by usually, I do not say Red Cross institutions because they could not use that, but they found neutrally sounding transportation companies, usually affected with an addition of medical treatment. They would come to the houses of the parents who had those children, and the parents were told that the state would take care of the children, that they did not have to worry any longer, that they should turn their children over to the state, and that they would bring them to these special houses where they would be taken care of. In reality, of course, they were brought to the places where they were put to death. And this, of course, they could not hide this over a longer period of time, particularly as in some instances, not all parents were happy to turn over their children. Of course, they did not have to worry, they did not have this kind of pressure of having sometimes normal children and all these other children and being exposed to all the hardship and the frustrations parents usually have when they have a handicap. But many cared nonetheless and went to visit their children. And so it happened that there was one instance where a family had just come to visit their child, and the next day they were told that the child had died after a long, painful sickness where they knew perfectly well that the child was in good shape the day before. So that this was a lie, and that this was only used to hide the euthanasia, that is the assassination of the child. And so incidents occurred. And these incidents made it more and more difficult to continue to carry out this. So that ultimately, once it became dangerous that maybe this might really be discussed openly, so they ended up this children's program, but nonetheless, it was ended only step by step, and it is estimated that in this so-called children's program, something like 5,000 children were put to death in these special asylums which the Nazis set up to kill them. And in doing this, they were already trying out what kind of special means they could use in terms of efficiency to put them to death. But this was only, I would say, the tip of the iceberg. Because parallel to this children's program, and soon afterwards, they devised now a much greater program, where they used a code word for. And this code word was T4. This T4 was not something very mysterious. It was just the address of the main doctor. This doctor's name was Buhler. You find him in Davidovich. This Buhler lived in the Tiergarten, T for Tiergarten number 4. So, and as he was put in charge by Hitler to carry out the program, it was called the T4 program, because of this private home of this special Nazi doctor. Now, this program will now be applied from 1939 on to the adults, not just to children, but to mentally or physically handicapped people, which adults, not just children. But there was, of course, one problem in all this. That was to define what represented a physical and more particularly a mental handicap. The Nazis will apply this formula of mentally handicapped in a very, I would say, in a very easy, widespread way. They would even consider as being Jewish could already be considered of being mentally handicapped. They would not do it openly, but later on, when they transferred this kind of a program to the concentration camps, they would do it. So in other words, they now launched this program on a vast scale. And this time it was not some isolated asylums, but a number of places which were spread all over Germany. Usually they were castles, which were then isolated, surrounded, so that nobody could come close. There were half a dozen of those places which were, organized in such a way that gassing possibilities, gas chambers were established, and other devices in terms of for executing people, for killing people. They were brought then also by special transportation agencies, but still they had to do away with the bodies. They could not turn the bodies back to the families because the families could, in some instances, they could order autopsies to look on what the real reasons were. So in other words, they had to burn the bodies. And so they had to establish crematoria. And these crematoria, of course, you could not hide the smoke which would come out of it and also the smell which would come out of it. And so that slowly the rumor spread of what was really going on in those places. And even children who lived in the neighborhood of those places, when then those transportation vans passed by, they would cry out now that the death boxes were passing. So ultimately it became increasingly difficult to hide this, until the Nazis ultimately met open protest. First, a doctor who was in charge of an urban district in Germany, I think it was Hamburg. This doctor refused to give up patients who had this kind of peculiarity of this mental or physical. He refused to participate in the program. And the Nazis did not dare to take retaliation against him. So this doctor got away with this resistance. So it was an error, it was wrong to pretend that if you did not cooperate, that you did take the risk of being put to death yourself. That is one thing. And secondly, after all, a cardinal, an archbishop of Münster, Cardinal Galen, Galen, when he heard about this, he went on his in his cathedral, on his Sunday preach, he would openly speak out against this and protest this and condemn it as being a scandal. Now, of course, the only people who heard about this were his audience, those in the cathedral. There were no media, there was no press, everything was controlled. But when Hitler was reported, when the SS became aware of this, Hitler gave the order to stop this program at once. But it had been carried out now for months, and it is estimated that as a consequence of the application of this program, something like 80,000 people had been put to death. Now, while they carried out this euthanasia program, they experienced now different means of assassination. They would experience vans. They would have a van where they would put the inmates into a closely knit place in the van and get the exhaust of the van inside this place where they were sitting. So the van would then, move around until those who had, been exposed to this exhaust until they were gassed practically as a consequence of the exhaust of the van. But that was considered very complicated. Then they also used poison in terms of injections, that they injected poisoned substance into the blood. This was also considered rather complicated. Then ultimately they would even simply let people die from hunger, from famine, put them into cells and not feed them. Ultimately, with all those tests which were made, they decided that the most efficient way were cyanide crystals, which they would use. And these cyanide crystals, there was one company who produced them, and that they had a company name, and that was Cyclone B. Cyclone B was that were crystals. In reality, it was solid cyanide, and when this was exposed to the air, it would begin fuming and passing out the gas, which would ultimately, in terms of inhalation, kill whoever was close to it. So this Cyclone B gas was then considered as being the most efficient way, and from that moment on, they will, in the concentration camps, in as much as they also use devices for executing prisoners, and later on in the extermination camps, this was then generalized in wider and wider gas chambers. But these tests were all done with a clear view of implementing mass executions of those whom they had, predestined for genocide, that is for the final solution, that is the Jews were, of course, those who would preferably be used for this. When they did forbid the T4 program, in reality, it was not totally forbidden, because it was so dangerous to implement it before the general public. It was transferred then to the concentration camps. In other words, it would be implemented now inside the concentration camps, where they used again another code name. It was FG, I don't know what, but the code name is not important. It was transferred into the concentration camps where it could be totally hidden. What is remarkable is what the doctors, because they were the ones who decided, the alleged doctors, what the doctors used as symptoms for determining of who was handicapped and who was not. And here, for instance, being a prostitute or being homosexual or being Jewish could be considered as being a handicap, a physical handicap, or in other words, this now by far did go beyond this so-called definition of mental or physical handicap. Now they included on the list of those who would be put to death so-called asocial or Jewish people, all kinds of people whom they considered were not worth living, were practically eating up the food of the so-called good Aryans, which should strengthen themselves for the future confrontation with those they prepared to attack. So in this case, the program continued until ultimately it practically was transformed into a normal annihilation execution plan once the extermination camps were established in the different places in Poland. Besides this euthanasia program, which was a part of the Nazi ideology and a part of the Nazi program, and where the Jews were supposed to be the main target, even though it remains an open question whether in case of a victory of National Socialism in World War II, that other categories of people might have been also selected for this kind of a treatment. But besides this, this was the negative element of the euthanasia program. The milder negative element was the sterilization program. The fiercer negative element was the euthanasia program. But there was also a so-called positive element, a positive eugenics program, because you should not only do away with those who did not correspond to your definitions, to your criteria of being healthy, racially and in every sense fit, but you should also try to produce positively children which would correspond to this criteria. And the one who was behind this was Himmler. Himmler was practically falling into his old habit of being a poultry farmer, when already on this level he made selections. Now he would, in some of his SS fortresses or some of his SS residences, he would make selections. For instance, there would be an appeal would be made to girls who would correspond to the Nazi, let's say, ideal of an Aryan girl, blue-eyed, blonde. They would be called upon to volunteer for the breeding purpose of this new race. And then they would then be put together with SS selected volunteers who would also correspond to this criteria of blue-eyed blonde. And there were only isolated testing grounds of this. They would call those places Lebensborn. Now you can imagine that the girls were not necessarily the most enthusiastic about it. It was different from the SS. They were, of course, volunteered to participate in this program. But they kept this a tight secret because they knew that if this would come to the public, then the SS, and not only the SS, that the Nazis would then, in all probability, take a risk of having then a major uprising, a major negative reaction on the part of the German establishment, and particularly on the part of the generals of the army, who would not accept this kind of breeding of the new race in the way the SS had imagined that they would carry it out.
They actually did that, and then they created a lot of people. I mean, they all be like bastards, and I mean, did they marry these people, or were they just like they get together?
Marriage was not considered the important thing. It was just procreation. But they did not get beyond original, some tests. And of course the question remains open. Had they won the war, would they have done it on... There is one statement of Goering. Goering was he was even more despicable than all the other killers, because he could make jokes when he spoke about these horrors, whereas Himmler and Heydrich would call things by their name. Goering, at a given moment, when he was asked, what are you going to do with this conquered living space at the expense of the Soviet Union? Then he said, well, we will expel most of the population in whatever conditions beyond the Ural Mountains, which will be, they will be out. We will kill off those remaining males who are behind. We will then, the girls and the women, we will launch upon them the SS stallions, who will then take over and will produce then a new race. That is what Goering, in one of his so-called free moments, mentioned. Now, of course, we cannot take this at face value, but the fact that this man, and he made a joke out of it, spoke like this, and that Himmler and his SS made tests about, bringing girls and boys together for these breeding purposes, at least on an incentive, on an early basis, we can imagine, because after all, Goering was not a nobody. And Himmler was not a nobody neither. Heydrich did not participate. Heydrich considered that Himmler was an idiot in terms of, let's say, rationality and so on. But this means, nonetheless, that there were no horrors which they did not imagine, not only in terms of death factories putting people to death, but also in terms of procreation. In other words, this would have destroyed any kind of decent, normal human community or human cell. It was really reducing mankind to a kind of animal-type breeding institution just for the sake of National Socialism and for the for increasing the number of Aryans and after the conquest of living space. I think we stop today. What I just said, most of those programs in terms of eugenics, sterilization and euthanasia were started around 1939 and were carried out, stopped or transferred to concentration camps once the war was on. We will, next time, we will turn again to the war, to the evolution of the war.